The candle she carried had no business being in that part of the house. Nora Blythe knew it. The knowledge sat in her chest like a swallowed stone as she moved through the east passage at 11:30. The flame cupped in her palm against the draught that crept beneath the wainscoting. She had been sent for extra linens from the upper linen press, a task any footman might have managed in daylight. But Mrs. Prout, the housekeeper, had a cold that had laid her low since Sunday, and the first footman had twisted his ankle badly in the stable yard that afternoon and was in no condition to manage the back stairs. And so, it was Nora who had taken the candle from the kitchen passage and climbed the narrow servant's stair with her sensible shoes on the ancient floorboards, the wood barely sighing under her step, because she had learned, in 5 years at Ashmore Park, exactly which boards announced a person and which ones did not. The east passage ran along the outer wall of the house's original structure, the old part, the part that had been built in the reign of the second king of that name, and had been added to in every subsequent generation, without anyone quite deciding what ought to be preserved and what amended. The portraits here were older, less fashionable, darker in their varnish. The wallpaper had been put up in the previous century and retained its quality in the way that expensive things do, with a slightly superior composure. There was no fire in this part of the house at this hour. The cold came off the stones and the glass in the narrow windows, and Nora's breath showed faintly in her candle flame as she walked. She was not looking for anything. That much was true. The door was not where she expected a door to be. It sat between the second portrait of the third Duke of Ashmore and a large blank panel she had always assumed concealed a chimney breast. It was not locked. It was not even fully latched. A line of yellow light showed at its base, thin as a thread of gold, and from behind it came a sound so small and so contained that Nora might have mistaken it for the settling of the house, for the groan of old timbers, for the particular silence that old houses carry inside them like a held breath. It was not the settling of the house. She stood with her hand raised, not quite touching the door, and the sound came again. And this time, she understood it completely. Someone was weeping on the other side of that wall, weeping in the way of a person who believed themselves entirely alone, without witness or comfort, without any expectation of either. It was the kind of crying that belongs to the deepest hours of the night, the kind a person keeps locked away from every face they know. Nora lowered her hand. She should have turned around. Every sensible instruction she had received in 5 years of service, every rule of her station, every careful boundary she had observed since arriving at Ashmore Park, told her to turn around and walk back down the east passage and fetch the linens and say nothing of what she had heard to anyone. A servant who stumbled into the grief of her betters was a servant who had overstepped, whether she had meant to or not. She turned around. She had gone no more than 4 paces when the sound changed, and she stopped again without deciding to stop. The weeping had sharpened into something that was almost a word, though not quite, a syllable swallowed before it could become speech. And the quality of it was such that Nora's hands had gone cold, and her candle wavered in a draught that did not exist. She did not turn back. She stood in the passage and did not move. And it was in this way that she first truly understood the shape of the situation she had walked into. Not merely that the Duchess of Ashmore was behind that door, but that the Duchess of Ashmore had been behind that door for a very long time. The Duchess of Ashmore was, by the general verdict of the county, a woman to be admired from a measured distance. Lady Cecilia Thorne, who had married the Duke 11 years past and become the Duchess Crestwood, was 31 years old, and had the kind of composure that drew comparison to the architecture of the house she occupied. She was beautiful in the manner of a well-kept formal garden, precise and ordered, and entirely impervious to weather. The house parties she arranged were spoken of in Bath and in London, with genuine approval. She never raised her voice. She never misplaced her countenance. She was, in the considered opinion of Lady Hartfield, who had known her since girlhood, quite beyond feeling, in the way that certain people are, which is not an insult to them so much as an observation of their particular constitution. Nora had worked in this house for 5 years and had formed no opinion on the matter, because she had learned very early that forming opinions about the family was a luxury she could not afford. She managed the household linen and the flower arrangements and the silver, when Mrs. Prout's rheumatism prevented it, and she spoke when spoken to, and did her work quietly, and drew no particular attention to herself. And this had served her well. She was 23 years old, and the daughter of a solicitor who had died indebted and left her with a modest education, 3 younger siblings, and no practical means of supporting any of them beyond entering service. She was not bitter about this. She had examined her situation with the clear eye she had inherited from her father, and concluded that bitterness required leisure she did not possess. She worked. The work sustained her family. The rest was beside the point. Her father had been a man of considerable intelligence and no financial judgment whatsoever, which was a combination more common than the world liked to acknowledge. He had been kind and well-read, and had taught her Latin at the kitchen table on winter evenings, and had died owing 3 creditors and a very patient bank, rather more than the house was worth. She had been 18. Her brothers were 15 and 11. Her sister was 8. She had stood in the parlor after the solicitor, a different solicitor, a living one, had read the will, and she had looked at the 3 of them looking at her, and she had understood in a single clear moment exactly what her education was worth in practical terms, and what she intended to do about it. She had been at Ashmore Park within the month. She had not, in 5 years, allowed herself to wonder about the rooms she did not enter, or the doors she did not open, or the particular heaviness that seemed to live in the Duchess's face at breakfast when no guests were present, and there was no performance required. She had not allowed herself to wonder, because wondering cost something, and she did not have it to spare. Her younger sister was 17 now, and clever enough to want a position of her own, and her eldest brother was reading law, and the second was apprenticed to a carpenter in the next village, and she sent money home at the quarter and at Christmas, and at the occasional moments when the work had been good, and there was some to spare. These were the facts of her life, and they were sufficient. And yet, here she stood, 4 paces from the linen press, and half a life away from the woman behind that wall, and her feet would not carry her in either direction. If you have ever stood in a passage in the small hours of the morning and known that you are facing a choice you did not choose to be given, you will understand something of what Nora felt in that moment. It was not heroism. It was not sentiment. It was the specific gravity of a particular kind of human sound, the kind that pulls you toward it, not because you are brave, but because you are not, finally, able to walk away. She went back to the door. She did not knock. Knocking, she understood with some certainty, would cause the Duchess to collect herself instantly and say something cool and impeccable about a mislaid candle. And Nora would curtsy and retreat, and the door would close, and whatever lived behind it would remain behind it. She pressed the door open instead, slowly, and held her candle up, and stood in the doorway of a room she had not known existed. It was not large. A low-ceilinged space tucked behind the great east wall, the kind of room that might have been a dressing room in an earlier century, before the house's later additions had made it redundant and forgotten. The plaster ceiling was unornamented. The 2 narrow windows gave onto the November dark and admitted a cold that had not been managed by any fire, because there was no fireplace here. Only the residual warmth of the candle and whatever warmth a human body produced when it sat very still for a long time. A single chair had been drawn up to a writing table that held one candle and a sheaf of letters arranged with a care that was itself a kind of grief, the care of a person who handles the same objects so frequently that they have ceased to be objects and become something else entirely. The letters were not sealed. Several had been opened and opened again, until the creases were worn soft, and the paper had gone pale with handling, and the ink, where hands had pressed repeatedly along the lines of writing, had smeared faintly at the edges of the words. On the floor beside the chair lay a pair of ivory-backed hairbrushes and a length of ribbon, blue and faded to the particular shade of blue that a thing reaches when it has been touched too many times to hold its original color. The Duchess of Ashmore was in the chair. She had not heard the door, or she had heard it and did not care, which amounted to the same thing. She was not wearing her day dress or any dress that Nora had seen before. She wore a plain, dark wool gown of a kind that would not have been out of place in a rectory parlor, a woman's gown, and not a duchess's, without trimming or ornament or any of the careful construction that made clothes into armor. Her hair was down and lay over her shoulder in a loose braid, and there were no jewels and no gloves, and no visible evidence of the person who moved through this house each day as though it had been built expressly to receive her. She was crying without sound now, which was somehow worse than the sound that had stopped Nora in the passage. Her hands were in her lap, open, palm upward, in the way of a person who has set something down that they have been carrying for a very long time. Her face was turned toward the narrow window, and her shoulders did not move, and there was something in her stillness that was the opposite of the composure Nora had always admired, and always, privately, been a little wary of. This was not a woman beyond feeling. This was a woman who had learned, at considerable cost and over a long period of time, to make feeling invisible, and who had come to this room for the hours when the cost of that lesson became temporarily more than she could pay. Nora said, very quietly, "Your Grace." The Duchess turned her head. What happened in the next moment was something Nora did not forget in all the months that followed. There was no alarm in the Duchess's face, no sharp recollection into dignity, no reaching for the particular expression she wore in public. There was only a long and exhausted recognition, the look of a person who has kept a fire banked for so long they have forgotten what it felt like to be warm, and who has been found sitting beside the cold grate. And then there was something else, something beneath the recognition, very small, that might have been relief. "Close the door," the Duchess said. Her voice was even. It had not recovered its usual precision, but it was even. Nora stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She did not sit. She stood near the door with her candle and waited, because waiting seemed to her the only correct action, the only one that did not presume something she had not been given. The Duchess looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "You ought to go back to bed." "Yes, Your Grace," Nora said. She did not move. Something crossed the Duchess's face that was not quite amusement and not quite sorrow, but contained elements of both. She said, "You are very composed for a woman who has just found a weeping duchess in a hidden room." "I have been told I am composed, Your Grace," Nora said. "I have never been entirely sure it is a virtue." The Duchess looked at her again, longer this time. She said, "What is your name? Not your position. Your name." "Nora Blythe, Your Grace." "Nora Blythe," the Duchess repeated, as though the name required some private assessment. Then she said, "Sit down, Miss Blythe, not on the floor. There is a stool behind the door." Nora found the stool and sat. They remained in silence for a time that Nora could not measure. The November wind pushed at the narrow windows, and the candles bent and recovered, and the house around them lay still in the particular silence of a sleeping household. The Duchess looked at her folded hands. Nora looked at the wall, and then at the worn blue ribbon on the floor, and then at her own hands, and then at nothing. At last the Duchess said, "These letters are from my daughter." Nora did not respond, because there was nothing to respond to, because she knew, as did every person in the county, that the Duchess had no daughter. The Duke of Ashmore had no heirs and no children, which was a circumstance discussed with some frequency in the kitchens, and occasionally in the drawing-room, and more occasionally in the county papers, in terms that made no allowance for the feelings of the people most directly affected by it. "She died 6 years ago," the Duchess said. "She was 4 years old. Her name was Alice." She said the name carefully, the way one handles an object that has been repaired too many times and must be handled gently, or it will not hold. "She had a habit of falling asleep with her ribbon in her hand. We could never persuade her out of it. She picked up the ribbon from the floor and held it for a moment and set it on the table beside the letters. I did not know, Your Grace," Nora said. She said it because it was true, and because the alternative was silence. And silence felt, in that particular moment, like an abandonment she was not willing to commit. "No one in this house does," the Duchess said. "The Duke does not speak of it. I do not speak of it. We have decided, between us, to manage. It is a reasonable decision. I understand it entirely." She paused. "I come here when I cannot manage, and I have nowhere else to go." She said this without inflection, the words arranged in their proper order, with the feeling removed, the way one arranges furniture before a room is lived in. And Nora understood with sudden and complete clarity exactly how long the Duchess had been coming to this room. Not months. Years. "Does anyone know this room exists?" Nora asked. The question had come out before she chose it. "My husband knew it when he was a boy," the Duchess said. "He has forgotten it, or chosen to forget it, which amounts to the same thing." She looked at Nora steadily. "I would prefer that it remain forgotten." "Yes, Your Grace." "Including by you, going forward." "Yes, Your Grace." Nora met her gaze. "I am very good at forgetting what I ought not to have seen." A silence. Then the Duchess said, "No. You are good at keeping what you have seen and saying nothing about it. That is not the same thing, and I find I prefer your version." She looked at the narrow window. "The Duke arrives from London tomorrow. There is a house party on Thursday. Lord Aldwych is bringing his sister, who is considered very eligible, and Lady Hartfield will come with her niece, who is also considered eligible, and the primary subject of the week will be the question of whether my husband will select one of them to become the mother of an heir, now that his marriage has proved inadequate to the purpose." Nora said nothing. "I am 31 years old," the Duchess said, and something moved in her voice for the first time, something tightly controlled and still moving, like water under ice. "Lady Hartfield told me last spring that I ought to consider the matter practically, that a woman in my position has a duty to the succession that supersedes personal sentiment. She was not unkind. She was simply correct, in the way that people are when they have never had occasion to feel the thing they are being correct about." "You are 31 years old," Nora said quietly, "and your daughter died 6 years ago, and no one in this house knows her name." The Duchess went very still. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Nora said. "That was not my place." "No," the Duchess said. "It was not." Another silence. "Her name was Alice Cecilia Crestwood, and she liked blue ribbon, and she fell asleep in my arms on the 14th of March and did not wake up." and you are the first person in 6 years to whom I have said her name." She did not weep again. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes clear and her face carrying a weight that was not composure and not grief precisely, but the particular gravity of a truth finally spoken into a room that could hold it. Nora sat on her stool and did not look away. They stayed until the candles burned lower, and Nora listened while the Duchess spoke in that careful, even voice of small things, mostly the color of Alice's hair, which had been very like her own, and the way the child had pronounced words with letters that challenged her, and the garden at the country house in Surrey, where she had spent the last summer of her life, catching beetles in a jam jar and releasing them with great ceremony. Nora did not speak much. She asked once whether the beetles had ever been recaptured, and the Duchess had said very quietly that Alice had found the same one 3 times running and had named him Frederick after a pompous neighbor. And something in the Duchess's face had shifted at that, not into happiness precisely, but into something adjacent to it, something that had been sealed away for a long time. At nearly 2 in the morning, Nora stood and said, "I should fetch the linens I was sent for. Mrs. Prout will notice if they are still in the press at sunrise." "Yes," the Duchess said. She had set down the letters and folded them neatly, and she sat now in the plain dark gown with the worn ribbon in her pocket, where she had put it at some point in the last hour. "Miss Blythe." Nora stopped at the door. "The house party will be a very complicated week," the Duchess said. "I could make use of someone with a good memory and a steady hand. There are considerable arrangements to manage." A pause. Very precise. "Mrs. Prout has mentioned that you have been in service 5 years. It is long service for a woman of your particular competence." "Yes, Your Grace. I require a personal attendant, someone who is competent and discreet. The position would be a considerable increase in your station and your wages." The Duchess looked at her steadily. "I am not offering it as payment for tonight, Miss Blythe. I want to be clear about that. I am offering it because I have needed someone capable in the position for some time, and I have not troubled myself to appoint one. If tonight has furnished me with a reason to see what was already in front of me, then it is not a debt, but an occasion." Nora said, "I would be glad to accept the position, Your Grace." "Good." The Duchess straightened the letters on the writing table. "Then I will see you in the morning." Nora curtsied and went to fetch the linens, and she said nothing to anyone about where she had been. And the hidden room behind the east wall was, as far as the rest of the household was concerned, a panel of old plaster and a chimney breast. The house party arrived on Thursday, as the Duchess had said it would. It arrived in the form of 4 carriages and a great quantity of luggage, and Lord Aldwick's sister, Miss Philippa Aldwick, who was 22 and had golden hair and the kind of easy confidence that belonged to young women who had never been required to manage anything more complicated than a dance card. She was not unkind. She was, in fact, genuinely pleasant. The sort of young woman whose pleasantness had never been tested by anything that required it to become more than pleasantness, and who therefore had every reason to believe it was sufficient. She laughed freely and spoke well of everyone present, and distributed her attention with gracious impartiality. And she looked at the Duke of Ashmore at dinner with the frank interest of a young woman who had been told that a duke's coronet was within reach if she arranged herself correctly, and who saw no particular reason she should not arrange herself correctly, it being a task she had been educated to. To the county, as Nora overheard Lady Hartfield remark to Lord Aldwick at the first evening's card party, she was exactly the right sort. Which was a thing said with satisfaction by a woman for whom exactly the right sort was a precise measurement, and not a vague compliment. The Duke of Ashmore was 40 years old and had the gray eyes and the jaw of a man who had made a considerable study of not showing what he felt, and had been so successful at this study that Nora, who was now in a position to observe him with some regularity, was not certain he remembered what was beneath the study. He was not unkind to his wife. He spoke to her with the careful formality of a man who has decided that courtesy is a wall and has lived inside the wall so long he has begun to think of it as architecture. He was not cold in the manner of a cruel man. He was cold in the manner of a man who has confused the management of feeling with the suppression of it, and who has practiced the confusion for long enough that it feels indistinguishable from character. He did not know about the hidden room. Nora was sure of this. He did not know about the letters or the ribbon or the name spoken into the small hours of November, and the certainty of his not knowing settled over Nora that week, like a cold hand on the back of her neck. She managed the arrangements. She was very good at arrangements. She had her father's eye for the structures underneath things, for the way that systems worked when they worked and failed when they did not. And she understood household management the way her father had understood property law, as a set of interlocking pieces that required not brilliance, but attention. The house party moved through its days in the ordered manner that the Duchess had constructed for it, and Nora was at the edge of every room, and she watched. She watched Miss Aldwych place herself near the Duke at every opportunity with the practiced ease of a woman who had been trained to it. She watched Lady Hartfield observe these placements with discreet satisfaction. She watched Lord Aldwych drink the Duke's excellent claret and laugh a little too loudly at his own stories, and look at the Duchess with the faintly pitying expression of a man who considered a barren wife a resolved matter. She watched the Duke. He was not looking at Miss Aldwych in the way Lord Aldwych and Lady Hartfield intended him to look at her. He was not looking at her at all, particularly, and this surprised Nora, who had expected, given the general arrangement of the week's events, a man in the process of calculating an advantage. He was, instead, on Thursday evening and Friday morning, and the long Saturday at the outdoor walking party to the ruins of the old mill, doing something Nora had not anticipated. He was watching his wife. Not openly. Not in a way that any of the assembled guests would have remarked upon. Nora, however, had a good memory and a steady hand, and she had been trained by 5 years of invisible service to see what was not meant to be seen. And what she saw was the Duke of Ashmore, on 3 separate occasions, turning his attention away from Miss Aldwych and away from Lord Aldwych and away from the entire careful architecture of the house party, and finding his wife across whatever room or garden they occupied, and watching her with an expression that was not calculation and not courtesy. She could not name it precisely. It was not love, or not only love, or not love, as she had seen it displayed. It was something older and more complicated than display, something that lived in the particular way his posture shifted when she came into a room, in the fractional pause before he looked away. She did not understand it. She understood it on Saturday evening. The walked party had returned from the ruins in the late afternoon, and the guests had gone to dress for dinner, and Nora had gone ahead to the Duchess's rooms to prepare them. And she was arranging the evening gloves on the dressing table when the Duke came in. He did not knock. He came into the outer room and stopped when he saw Nora, and she curtsied and moved toward the door, but he said, "Stay a moment," in the voice of a man who was not accustomed to being uncertain, and was being uncertain now. And the uncertainty itself had caused him to say something he had not entirely intended to say. She stayed. He looked at the room with the look of a man who does not often stand in the rooms his wife occupies when she is not in them. The dressing table with the gloves laid out in their order, the morning shawl on its hook, the correspondence arranged by the small writing desk at the window. These were not things he had arranged or seen arranged. These were the details of a life conducted quietly alongside his own. And they were, Nora saw, somewhat unfamiliar to him. He looked at the small portrait on the far wall. Nora had learned, in her first weeks in the position, which picture it was. It was the only image of Alice that had survived a period some years past when the Duke had, in a grief he had never acknowledged to anyone, put away every other likeness. The other portraits and miniatures, the small oil painting that had been commissioned when the child was 2, the sketches in the schoolroom album, all of it had been quietly removed. This miniature alone had remained, an ivory-framed oval on the far wall of the Duchess's dressing room, a child with her mother's coloring and her father's gray eyes. He could tell himself it was a miniature of his wife. He could not tell himself that when he was not being deliberate about it. He looked at it for a long moment. His face did not move. It was a face that had learned not to move, and it was not moving now. But what it cost to keep it still was visible to anyone who was paying the kind of attention that Nora had been paying since November. Then he said, "She has been better these last weeks. The Duchess." He said this to the room rather than to Nora, in the voice of a man who is not precisely speaking to the person present, but requires the presence of another person to speak at all. Nora said nothing. "She has seemed, I think, less—" He paused. "Less alone." Nora said carefully, "I believe she may be, Your Grace." He turned and looked at her then, with the full attention of the gray eyes that his daughter had inherited, and Nora met the look steadily. She did not, in this moment, perform the invisibility of her station. She met his eyes because he required it, because the question underneath his words was one he did not know how to ask directly, and she was the only person in this house who was in possession of the answer. He said, "She does not speak to me." Nora said, "No, Your Grace." "She has not," he said. And then he stopped. And then, very quietly, "I did not know how to remain in the same house as it. The loss. I was not made to be in the same room as it, and so I removed myself from the room, and it seemed to me a reasonable management of an unmanageable thing. And now I find that I have managed myself very thoroughly out of every room my wife occupies, and I do not know how to go back in." He was not speaking to Nora. He was speaking to the miniature on the wall and to the room, and to some version of himself who had made a series of decisions that had seemed practical at the time. Nora said, "Your Grace." He looked at her. "There is no one in this house who knew her name." He went very still. "Until recently," Nora said. "Your Grace." She saw it cross his face, not the precise thing she had seen in the Duchess's face in the hidden room, but its equivalent. The same quality of something sealed cracking open at a seam. The same exhaustion of a person who has kept something contained for so long. They had begun to believe that containment was the same as surviving it. He said very quietly, "Alice." And that was the whole of it. One word, spoken in a room that had held the miniature for 6 years, and the silence around it for just as long. Nora curtsied. "I believe the Duchess takes a turn in the East Garden before dinner when the weather permits," she said. "It is mild this evening." She left the room. She did not watch what happened next, because it was not hers to watch. She went to assist the second housemaid with the table arrangements, and she did the work she had been given, and she said nothing to anyone about what she had heard or what she had said or what she had seen in the Duke of Ashmore's face when a single syllable had undone 11 years of managed architecture. The Duchess came to dinner with a look that was not composure and not grief, but something between them, something that had a little warmth in it, and she sat beside her husband, and they did not speak to one another very much. which was not different from any other evening of the house party, except that the particular quality of the silence between them had changed. It was not the silence of two people on opposite sides of a wall. It was the silence of two people who have just discovered that the wall had a door. Miss Aldwych told a very amusing story about a dog and a hat that made everyone laugh, and Lady Hartfield looked satisfied, and Lord Aldwych drank rather more claret than was entirely decorous, and Nora moved through the evening with the particular invisibility of a servant who has learned that the most important work is the work no one sees. The house party concluded on Monday. The carriages were loaded, and the guests were dispatched with the warmth and efficiency that the Duchess managed without apparent effort, and by noon the house had recovered the particular quiet of its private self. Lady Hartfield was the last to leave. She paused at the door of the drawing-room where the Duchess stood to receive her farewells, and she looked at the Duchess with the assessing eye of a woman who has been certain of an outcome and is now uncertain of it. And she said, "Cecilia, you look well." "Thank you, Lady Hartfield," the Duchess said. "You look," the older woman said, with the slight frown of a person reviewing an assessment, "quite remarkably well." "The East Garden," the Duchess said serenely, "is very restorative this time of year." Nora, standing at the appropriate distance with the Duchess's gloves and her mourning shawl, permitted herself no expression whatsoever. Lady Hartfield departed. The days that followed were quiet ones, the quiet of a house settling into a new arrangement of itself. The Duke did not go back to London. He remained at Ashmore Park for 2 weeks and then 3, which was a circumstance the household noticed without remarking upon, because servants who remark upon the behavior of the family are servants who do not remain servants for long. Mr. Hewson the butler said nothing. Mrs. Prout, recovered from her cold, said nothing. The kitchen said nothing, which was the most telling silence of all, and was a measure of how thoroughly the household had understood that something had shifted without anyone being able to name the thing. Nora noticed. She noticed the Duchess at breakfast with color in her face that was not produced by anything external, the color of a woman who had slept, which sounds like a small thing, and was not a small thing, because she had not, in Nora's observation, been sleeping well for a very long time. She noticed the Duke reading in the library in the evenings, and the Duchess in her chair near the window, with her own book, and the specific quality of that proximity, which was no longer the proximity of two people being careful with one another across the silence of a shared loss, but something more like the proximity of two people who have remembered that they came to occupy the same rooms by something other than accident. She noticed the morning when she brought the Duchess her correspondence, and the Duke was already there, not in his customary chair at the writing table, where he managed his correspondence at a considered remove, but standing near the window, where his wife sat with the morning light on her. And the Duchess was reading him a letter aloud in that careful, even voice, something from the county's book society, Nora thought, though she was not close enough to hear the words, and he was listening with his whole body turned toward her in the way that she had not seen from him in any room since she had arrived in this house. It was a small thing. It was the way a man stands when the person speaking matters to him. She had not seen him stand that way toward his wife before. She noticed the afternoon she passed the East Garden, and saw them walking together at a proper social distance that was not the distance of social performance, but the distance of two people who have reached the moment just before a lesser distance becomes possible, and who know it, and are not yet ready to cross it, and are patient with themselves and with one another for the first time in a very long while. She did not think about what she had done, or whether it had been her place to do it. She had long since concluded that her place was a complicated question, and that the answers available to a woman in her particular situation were not the same answers available to women in other situations, and that the most useful thing she could do with a complicated question was to answer it correctly and keep working. It was on a Friday evening in December that she found herself in the East Passage again, carrying a stack of letters to the writing room as she had been asked. The candles had been lit for the evening already, there being no cold drafts to navigate by a single taper now that the house was properly occupied. And the passage was warm and amber, and she was walking at a steady pace because she had 3 more tasks before the dinner hour. She heard it from behind the panel in the wall between the second portrait and the blank plaster, and she stopped. The sound was not weeping. It was very low, and she might have been wrong about it, but she did not think she was wrong. She had heard the East Passage in every season and at every hour, and she knew the voices of every person in this household. And what she heard now was not the house settling, and not the wind at the narrow windows, and not the particular loneliness of a woman who had nowhere else to take her grief. It was 2 voices, close together in the small room behind the wall, talking quietly, and the quality of the sound was not grief and not the managed silence of 2 people being careful with one another around a thing they could not yet touch, but something that had warmth in it, a specific and private warmth. The warmth of a room that has been cold for a long time and has been gently brought back. And then, in the Duke's voice, a name. Alice. Not raw as it had been that October evening in the dressing room. Not the syllable of a man who has not said a word aloud for 6 years and finds it sits in his chest like a coal. It was steady. Steady in the way of a word that has been said often enough that it no longer carries the full weight of the first saying. It was a name being used, not recovered. It was a name that belonged to the conversation, natural as any other word. Nora walked on. She delivered the letters to the writing room and adjusted the fire screen and went about the remainder of her tasks with the unhurried competence that was the only kind she permitted herself, and she did not think about what she had heard because there was no thinking required. Some things require only the knowledge that they have happened and no further examination. She delivered the letters to the writing room and went to the silver cupboard where she had work to do, and did the work without hurry and without sentiment, and without any of the particular satisfaction that she was, she thought, allowed to feel, but did not need to display to anyone. In the spring, the Duchess told her that she was with child. She said it early in the morning in late April, a Tuesday. With the light coming in at the dressing-room window at the particular angle it reached only in April, long and gold and particular to the season. She said it simply and without ceremony, which was, Nora had come to understand, the way the Duchess said the things that mattered most to her, the things that could not afford the weight of ornament. The quality of stillness in her face was not the stillness of containment. It was not the stillness of a woman who has sealed something away. It was the stillness of something held gently, the way one holds a small and living thing that can bear weight, but need not be pressed, that requires only to be carried carefully while it grows strong enough to carry itself. Nora said, "I am very glad, Your Grace." "Yes," the Duchess said. The word carried something in it that the Duchess almost never permitted her words to carry in front of other people. She looked at the window and at the east garden below it, where the first green was coming in along the old stone wall. The bright, specific green of early spring that never quite looks the same in any later season, and she was quiet for a moment in the way of a woman who is allowing herself to feel something without deciding yet how to describe it. Then she said, "Her name will be in the middle, if it is a girl. I have decided." "Alice?" Nora said. "Alice?" the Duchess said. "Yes." A pause. He agreed without hesitation. He said, "Yes, of course it should be Alice," as though it were the only possible answer, which I suppose it is. She looked at Nora steadily. He's been coming to the room with me, some evenings. Since January. We sit in there and we talk, and sometimes we do not talk at all. And it is, I find, not the room I thought it was. It is not only the room where I went to grieve. It is, it turns out, only a room. A room with a door, Nora said. The Duchess looked at her for a moment. Then, very quietly, she said, "Yes, exactly that." She turned from the window and picked up the blue ribbon from the writing table where it had lived since November, the worn and faded thing that a 4-year-old girl had carried to sleep through all the evenings of her short life, and she folded it once with deliberate care and placed it in the small box that sat beside the miniature on the mantelpiece. Not put away. Set beside. In the light where it could be seen by anyone who entered the room. Nora looked at it, and then at the miniature of the gray-eyed child in the ivory frame. And then she looked away, because some things are not hers to carry. And she knew the difference. She opened the door to the morning. The house around them was warm and full of the sound of ordinary things. The early kitchen, a door in the west wing, the particular creak of the back stairs as someone descended with purpose. Outside the window, the east garden was coming green again along the old stone wall, and the season was beginning in the way that seasons do, without asking whether you are ready for it, only arriving, only offering itself, green and insistent, and entirely sure of what it is. The box sat on the mantelpiece beside the miniature, and the ribbon inside it had belonged to a child named Alice, and the room was warm and in the light, and the season was beginning. If you have stayed with this story until the end, leave a word in the quiet below. Some stories find their way back to you when you need them most.